because we get into some pretty interesting stuff that we talk about on the way down. And then as I'm getting ready to talk here, I get a text message from the Norman program. Are you talking today? Which is not on my swear to God is not. Yes, I am, but not here. So anyway, I swear to God that was not on my schedule. That's been rescheduled, so we're good. Okay. Initially, I was asked, okay, well, what do you want to talk about? You talk about anything you want. And so I thought, well, I sort of want to get you guys to who I am, a little bit to the topic of disaster medicine, but I don't want to sit here and go through a boring little talk about disaster medicine, which can get that way. So really what I want to do is give you a little bit of a view of what is disaster medicine, what do we do in disaster medicine, how does that relate to emergency medicine, how it has changed over the last 30 years, and why it's important to you as an emergency physician to understand what it is we do in one of your sister areas, disaster medicine. All of you are disaster physicians, whether you know this or not. Every one of you will be called upon at a number of times during your career, no matter where you are at, to be involved in working casualties from some sort of mass casualty or disaster. There's a term that is growing in utilization, and that's called mass casualty disaster, and MCD is the abbreviation for it. I want all of you to know that one of the other things I'm trying to do in my role as director, there's a consortium of currently 12, soon to be 15 residencies that Team Health has partnered with. You are one of them. And I am responsible for running that whole consortium of all these residencies, trying to make products available for your residency, trying to get you involved in working with some of these other residencies collaboratively for education, for research, for all sorts of cool stuff. And starting in October, there's going to be a easy access point through Team Health to get that done. And we're also trying to open up portions of the Team Health website for residents if you're not registered or moonlighting with Team Health. So anyway, be that as it may, I want to talk to you a little bit about disaster medicine. And I decided probably the best way to do that is to give you just a little bit of an intro to the general idea of what disaster medicine is, and then to cover a specific type of event. And so what we're going to do is cover mass shooting events. And I want you to get an idea of what it is that a disaster physician does when they look at a particular event, and what it is that they do that can benefit you as an emergency healthcare provider. So, without further ado, let's talk a little bit about mass shooting events. Mass shooting events obviously are something that we hear a fair amount about. We hear a whole hell of a lot about it immediately following one occurring. And what's the major thing that we typically hear that occurs almost immediately after there's any kind of a mass shooting event?
Guns are evil.
Guns are evil. What? What else? That's it? Just guns are evil? Or is that all we hear? Okay. So we hear all kinds of stuff. Usually there's a group of people with an agenda that guns are evil, and that is the root of this whole problem, and if we just didn't have guns, then we wouldn't have this problem, right? There would be no mass shootings. We hear how these particular ideologies or philosophies, one way or the other, are the root cause as to why people go out and mass kill other individuals. We hear references to previous events and how we haven't learned, and we haven't changed our laws, and we haven't changed things. So there's a huge political agenda, and all of this is based on what human factor? Theory is based on rationalism, which is a human factor, but it's not a big one, unfortunately. Right? Most of what you hear comes out directly based on the emotion. Somebody waltzes into a grade school and kills 28 first graders and their teacher to boot. Okay? That's kind of impactful. If that doesn't bother you, I don't want to work with you. Okay? huge emotional impact. And so at that point in time, what we're doing is we're reacting emotionally. Many years ago, 30 some odd years ago, when I started getting into this business, much of what we did in the field of disaster medicine was based on emotional reports, because it's really bad when the tornado comes through and wipes out a town and kills a bunch of kids in a grade school or whatever. All right. Individual reports of what maybe happened, or at least what we thought happened, and lots of anecdotal information. That's what we based our planning and our response on. Okay? Not good enough. If that's all we did in emergency medicine, we would still be doing all kinds of interesting things, from bloodletting to, which may not be a bad idea, okay, and don't get that it is, to leeches, to who knows what. But we made a difference in that we began to look at these things rationally, and we began to look at the data. Now, what's disaster medicine? Just, you're going to be wrong. Just tell me.
Big trauma event.
Big trauma event, mass casualty. What else?
That's all I got.
What? Okay. What's a disaster doc do?
Kind of.
Other than Monday morning or
like
quarterback, yeah.
Treatment first.
Okay. 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 Can you define a disaster?
When the demand exceeds the resources.
Not bad. When the demand for health care exceeds the resource to provide that health care. But usually it's considered, depending on your point of view, the immediate demand for that health care. Okay. So what if I'm a disaster doc and we're going to talk about mass shooting events, what kind of information do you want to know?
How many people been shot?
Okay.
What kind of weapons been used?
What kind of weapon? Okay. Do you know how to take care of gunshot wounds? Have you ever taken care of a gunshot wound?
No.
Who's taking care of a gunshot wound? Okay. Do you guys know pretty much how to take care of a gunshot wound? Well, if you don't by now, you're in trouble. Okay. This is freaking Lawton. All right. So what I'm saying is, I don't need to teach you guys how to take care, for the most part, other than in your residency, how to take care of ballistic wounding. All right? You're an ER doc. You know about gunshots, car accidents, and heart attacks. I mean, you're pretty good at that. All right? But what I need to do is to tell you, how does this event differ in the quality of those wounds, and the patients you're going to see, and the things you might need to do or have access to, because it is now a mass casualty disaster event, or an MCD event. Okay? So, disaster medicine does not necessarily exist to teach you how to do your job as an emergency physician. This is one of the reasons that ER docs make such good disaster medicine docs, is because you have the full skill set. You know how to take care of the bumps and the boo-boos and the earaches and the chronic crap that comes in all the time. But you also know how to take care of the acute amputations. You know, hell, you might even know how to go out into the field and cut somebody's leg off to get them out of the rubble. Okay? If not, I know some people can train you to do that. Okay? And so it is an extension of what we do in emergency medicine into the community. In emergency medicine, we look at airway, breathing, circulation, disability, exposure, primary, secondary surveys, evaluation, disposition, right? For an individual patient. In disaster medicine, we look at the same things, but we do it on a population level. In other words, I'm looking at airway, breathing, circulation, metaphorically, for my entire community. How is it that my community and the resources that I have and my emergency healthcare resources and the extended medical community, how do we have to interact and work with the pre-hospital elements? How do I have to get patients processed through the emergency department surgery or ICU or ward or home or follow-up care or counseling for radiation exposure or all of those things. So you take what we do as emergency physicians and you put it in the community. So that general idea having been said, let's look at mass shootings in that perspective. So what do I want to do? I want, first of all, for you guys to develop a familiarization with the probable number of casualties that you're going to see and what the spectrum of those injuries are going to be. Wouldn't it be great if somebody said, oh crap, we just had an F4 tornado go through the south side of Lawton and it's destroyed probably this many blocks, and you're sitting there going, okay, well that means we're going to have about 10 immediate patients. We're probably going to have 40 some odd, what time of day is it? Okay, we're going to have 40 some odd minimals, and we'll have about another additional, by the time the day's over, 100 ambulatory, and out of that the percent is going to be, because it missed the school, the percent of pediatric population is going to be 4%. Wouldn't it be great if you could do that? I already know what I'm going to see. I already know what I'm going to see. And guess what? I already know the spectrum of injuries. You know, I know, okay, soft tissue injuries, highly contaminated, that's the number one thing I'm going to see. So I need to be pulling out my wound care stuff, and I need to be thinking about, well, how do you take care of these highly contaminated wounds? So I don't want a 80-year-old endocrinologist down here helping out sewing concrete into wounds. Okay, so we want these done correctly. Now, the other thing is I'm going to need my orthopedist, because the most common cause of admission during this type of an event are long bone fractures. I may need a neurosurgeon or two, but I do know the most common cause of death during a tornado is head injury. That's why we recommend helmets for people, because that's what kills them. Wouldn't it be great if you could do that? Guess what? You can do that. You can do that. And people think you're a freaking wizard, because you're right most of the time. Now, there's a few caveats, and we'll talk about one with mass shootings where those things change. But that won't surprise you either, because you know what those differences or those various little variations to these kinds of events are going to do. So what we're going to do with the mass shooting is, I do want you to become familiar with those things. We're going to talk about, well, if I don't keep turning it off, we're going to talk about the response and intervention in the emergency department and pre-hospital that are likely to maximize the survival of those casualties and to maximize the good outcomes, because that's what you want to do, right? You want to do good things for people, and so you want to do the best you can. Well, if you understand your enemy, you understand the mass shooting event and the way it rolls out, then you can anticipate stuff and you'll be ready for it, okay? And you do a better job. We also want to provide some scientific guidance with regard to how do you triage these people. We want to also review and discuss how this differs or impacts or alters what we think of on a normal daily basis for our trauma system and our trauma service, because there's some differences. So really, what am I doing? Typically when I ask people, years ago in particular, other than you guys are a little inhibited right now, but I would ask people, so what's disaster medicine? And they say, oh yeah, well, I'm going to go out, there's a big disaster, and I'm going to get with a group of people, and we're going to go out in the field, we're going to join a DMAT, or we're going to do something like that. We're going to go out, we're going to take care of those people in the field, we're going to provide health care in the field. Okay, well, yeah, that's a piece of it, but that's not the big piece. The big piece is right here in the emergency department, where your ED and your healthcare facility has to respond to a community event. This is where the knowledge is needed, because for a lot of reasons, DMATs do a really good thing, but what really does, you know what a disaster medical assistance team is, right? How many of you are on a DMAT? How many of you have heard that term before? Okay, a few. A DMAT is basically a federalized team. Let's say that there's a hurricane that comes through and wipes out the medical infrastructure. A DMAT is a specific team that brings everything they need with them using federal resources and sets up a clinic or a little ER somewhere. And the idea is that they provide in that area, they reestablish some form of medical infrastructure until the native infrastructure can recover. What it does not mean, which was the idea that people used to have all the time, it does not mean that I'm jumping from building to building saving burning babies. Okay? That is not what we do. Okay? You can get firemen and tactical people and so on to do those kinds of things. Those are very limited events. And that is not what we do. And it's a good thing, because I'm not very good at that.
And you're too valuable to do that. I mean, you
I don't know about that, but so anyway, so what we do here, what we're doing here is I'm going to show you that there's a lot of emotion, a lot of ideas about mass shooting events. But what we're going to talk about is what we know from what little science we have. Now, some of these events, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, etc., we have some reasonably good data about what actually happens and what the impact on the emergency department really is. Mass shooting is not one of those areas. But we do have some valid data. We do have some valid information. So let's look at what that is and find out what we can learn about this thing from that. All right. You're going to talk about something, you have to define something. And you will find that most of the definitions of mass shooting are politically motivated, because people have particular political agendas. Whether, you go from nobody should have guns to everybody, including those kids, should have had guns. Because if they don't, if there's a 5-year-old with a 45, that guy would have maybe gotten one of them, but he wouldn't got very many of them, right? Okay, I get it. So the data, the definitions, and the story get warped following those political agendas, and because of that emotional impact behind it, that's all you ever hear is their emotional opinion. Except occasionally there's some people who actually try to do some science. And if you're going to do some science, you need a definition. So this is actually the one I use. This actually comes from the CDC. Now, in case you don't know it, I'm a public health doctor as well, because public health and disaster medicine go hand in hand for a number of reasons. I got a whole talk about that, which is really cool. It basically revolves around who is the federal government given the authority and the funding to. It's public health. So if you want to work in disaster medicine, you kind of need to know what these guys are talking about. Okay, so what we want to do is come up with a definition. And I use this one. This is an early definition that was agreed upon by the CDC and by the FBI. And if you stick to the same definition, then you can actually look for changes and trends as you go through epidemiologically. Now, the problem is that it's gotten to the point now where one guy walking into a business and shooting one other person, that's a mass shooting event. No, that's not a murder. Okay? Now, are mass shooting events murders? Hell yes. But you got to draw the line. And so this definition, I think, it's the one that had been around the longest. It is not generally used by the news media at all or by people with political agendas, but it's still the one that kind of underlies all the real epidemiologic work. And that is an event with greater than 5 casualties. They don't have to be deaths. And by the way, I use the term casualty much more than I use the term victim, because I think it gives kind of a bad connotation. But greater than 5 casualties, 1 or more shooters. They have to be acting together. In other words, they don't both just show up on the same day. Oh, you were going to kill him too? Damn. Okay, they actually sort of planned this out, and they're acting together one way or the other in a time frame of 24 hours or less. So we have a definition. Okay, so based on that definition, I've been able to sort of screen through and select a few publications that actually have some decent information. All right. How many, now let me rephrase that. Oh my God, he's looking at me. Are the number of shootings, mass shootings, if we stay to that one definition, in the United States, are they increasing, decreasing, or staying the same since, well, I don't know, 1970? Are there more of them? Fewer of them?
Increasing.
Increasing? Okay. Increasing, decreasing, staying the same?
Staying the same.
Okay. How many of you think they're increasing? Raise your hand. How many of you think they're decreasing? How many of you think they're staying the same? Okay. Most people say they're staying about the same. Well, this is a graph that actually plots out, starting in 1960, the number of mass shooting events in the United States that meet the definition, the FBI definition. Now note that this stops the year 2000, but I have more data. All right, so what do you see? Actually, you know, you start hitting the mid part of the 90s and the number actually starts to drop, doesn't it?
Cocaine cowboy era.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's Cuban, that's why. That's about it.
So in reality, when we look at the numbers, up until about the millennium change, mass shootings have been going up and then they begin to come down. Now, people will look at that often, and with their political agenda, they'll say things like, well, that's because we have increased gun laws in many. And on the other side, they'll also say, yes, and that's about the time that we got most of the states, many of the states, to come up with concealed carry licenses, etc. So there's more guns out there. So argument. I don't care. It is what it is. It is telling me something. Now, the question then becomes, what is going on now on up into 2017? And the answer is there's a trending increase. So it is not that sharp, but what we see is that this has gone doing strange things. Oh, okay. What we find is that there is a slight trending increase. Yes?
Is this just America, or is this worldwide?
It's just United States. Yeah. This is only in the United States, and only those that meet the definition, the FBI CDC definition that I put out. Okay? And this actually comes from the Brady campaign. The data comes from the Brady campaign, which is, you know, definitely got a political agenda. You know, and I'm not here to give you a specific viewpoint on political agenda, but I'm here to try to tell you what we actually know based on the data. So we do know that it's increasing just a little bit. So this is, I'm sorry, is a wee bit fuzzy, but I think it's an important graph. And again, this goes just out to, I think it goes out to about 2015, something like that, or 2012, something like that. What this is shows a graph on the top. These are the number of, I hate the word victims, that we see, okay, per event, per year, okay? So you had some years where you had big events with a lot of people. You had some years where you had next to no, I did it again. You have some events, that's why I should use the laser, right? Where you have little to no casualties during that particular year. And so the bottom line actually shows the number of incidents. And what we find, for the most part, is statistically staying about the same. So since at least the 1970s, and actually if you pull this all the way back into the 1960s, you end up with pretty much the same number of mass shooting events. Now, how many of you have got that feeling from watching the news media?
It's way reported now,
Yeah.
and it wasn't when I was a kid.
Right. So it's, I mean, it is way over-reported. And like I said, anybody walks in anywhere with a gun, that's a mass shooting event. It's all over the news. Okay? These are horrible, emotion-packed, terrible events. But they are not consuming our society, if you look at the actual numbers. Do we need to do something about it? Hell yes. We need to figure out what to do about it. Well, what have I decided to do about it? I've decided to try the best I can to educate you guys about what we really know about these things, so that should they happen in your community, you're better equipped to respond to them. That's what a disaster medicine doc tries to do. Okay, so there's that info. So to understand mass shooting events, you have to understand the nature of the beast. And part of that is that getting real data, extremely difficult to obtain. Why is it difficult to obtain? Because really there are very few formal epidemiologic studies performed on any of these people or on any of these events. So we really don't know anything more than anecdotal reports that come out. Beyond that, these are fraught with legal and investment. This is a crime. And because it's a crime, there's a lot of information that is clamped down on, that you're not allowed to talk about, that you're not allowed to collect, and it makes it very difficult. I wrote a paper a number of years ago about how to use the Freedom of Information Act to go in and uncover some of this information after the event, after the prosecutions are over. All this stuff's a matter of public record. And you can actually file FOIA requests and obtain some of this information from local law enforcement, from the FBI, from just about any investigative agency, and substantially improve your ability to investigate this stuff. You don't just go to the hospital records, because they're going to miss most of the cases. Okay? And so there actually are ways of doing that. The bad thing is that since I wrote that paper 15 years ago or thereabouts, most of these agencies have figured out ways of getting around that. So it's almost impossible to get valid investigative information today on these events, but we still try. We still try. So most of what you end up really getting comes from public domain, and you know the quality of most public domain stuff. And I have to admit that in many instances, to try to collect this information, you're looking at archived news media reports, and you know how inaccurate that stuff is. So, and then beyond that, highly political and emotional background, as I've said again and again and again. So that's what makes understanding mass shootings very, very difficult to do. So the question then becomes, how do we get any valid information? Is there any information anywhere that somebody has collected in a scientific manner about ballistic wounding that might be of some use to us in understanding the phenomenon of mass shooting events? Does anybody, any agency or organization in the United States, kept any data or information that might be of some utility?
Probably the military.
What? The military? Absolutely. Studies that have been done with mass shooting events, as it were, are associated with military, and precise data has been kept on wounding. And a lot of that data has been well analyzed, and it works well in that setting. So yes, we can utilize some of this information. Notice I said some of the information, because you have to understand the difference in the populations. All right? So if we're going to apply some of these background ideas to mass shooting events, let's talk about what is the difference between the population in the military that was studied and our civilian populations. So here we are. First of all, combatants in the military generally are fairly healthy and fit. Generally. Okay? Depends on which National Guard unit you're from and how friendly you were with the surgeon that does your physical. But I remember right before the first Gulf War, I was still on active duty at the time. I was at Fort Hood, and we had Arkansas National Guard come through, and I had a guy just prior to them deploying who came in, and his reason for being there was that he needed to have his prescription for his insulin refilled before he deployed to the field. And we had guys with pacemakers that came in and said, well, I think 6 months ago I need to have the battery changed and I'm getting ready to deploy. So yeah, don't always assume they're healthy and fit, but for the most part they were. Combatants usually have some sort of ballistic protection. Okay, some flak jackets, some sort of Kevlar, something that helps protect them from the ballistics, so that alters the issues. You see multiple penetrating wounds from explosive devices, more commonly in the military than you do anywhere else, although we do have bombs in the civilian setting as well. But those multiple wounding mechanisms are more common in the military, and some of that info and data is mixed in. So you have to be able to understand how to pull that out and just look at the ballistic wounding. And also, as opposed to military shooters, civilian shooters fire at very close range. It is usually, you know, quote, point blank when the firing is done. Whereas military, 100 yards, you know, there's a fair standoff distance. So they're the kind of the key differences. Let's talk about the types of weapons used. In, let's say, the right chest in front of the world's best trauma center. Do I want to be shot with a typical military weapon, or do I want to be shot with a typical civilian self-defense weapon? Which one? Yeah, I would much rather be shot with a military weapon. Why?
Go right through you.
What are they designed for? They are designed to wound, not necessarily kill. Now they'll kill, but for the most part, the theory behind military weaponry, and we're talking the sidearms and the light arms. I mean, we're not talking you know, cluster bombs and stuff like that. Those will kill. Okay. But the typical military weapon is designed to create a wound. Why? Because if I wound you, then if my military or my army is going to have any confidence in me at all, you have to understand that if I get wounded, they're going to help me. I mean, they're going to get me back to medics. So I now pull you and you off the front line to take him back. Okay? Wow. I'm going to wound a lot of people, because the more I wound, the more have to be pulled off to go take care of these guys and use more and more resource. If I kill you, okay, you're dead. The other guys keep right on fighting and go on. Whereas civilian weapons, for the most part, are designed, not I think necessarily intentionally, but it works out that they're designed to kill. Because you want to stop that individual who's kicking the door into your house. You want that done and over with. You don't want to wound him because his two buddies are not going to carry him off necessarily. Okay? So that's the primary difference between the weapons utilized. The other thing is delay in emergency care. The military has the system that everything in the United States has been patterned after with regard to trauma systems and rapid transport and movement of patients off the front line after they've been wounded. Okay? We have patterned a civilian system similar to that, but it is not necessarily as efficient. I mean, that was the big deal back in about the 60s and 70s, in particular the 60s, the National White Paper that came out about the nature of trauma in the United States. And the deal was, if you were a soldier and you were wounded, shot in Vietnam, your chances of survival were substantially higher than if you were involved in a car crash in Lawton, Oklahoma. Because the system did not exist anywhere in the United States, really, in a few local places, to mobilize the type of trauma mechanism that you needed for that. And so we begin to develop them. We have a great trauma system now, but there's some issues associated with mass shooting in that. There is stress on the emergency healthcare system when this occurs, but usually there's situation. You already have assets allocated to that. Your helicopters fly. Your system typically works reasonably well, unless you stumble into a really bad situation. But in the United States, it's hit or miss. You know, you may not have the resource to get a mass group of people who've been shot transported effectively, evaluated, treated, and run through the system. So we experience greater stress on our healthcare system than military for the most part. We also have to deal with the families and the loved ones, investigative agencies that come in, the news media, and a number of medical legal issues. Nobody, to my knowledge, has been reported as of yet to be sued as an individual emergency healthcare provider who is taking care of a mass shooting casualty as of yet for poor care. There's been one attempt to sue an institution, which was eventually dropped, but you'll see it, obviously, as these continue, and you're in the wrong place at the right time. All right, so we have a trauma system, right? What's the difference between our typical trauma system and information that we gained from mainly, and I can never pronounce that, WEDMET, and I don't have it on there. Do you remember exactly what it's? Weapons
Development.
Yeah. Basically what they did is they kept all the possible information they could from all these kids that were shot in Vietnam, and they put it into this big thing, and the idea was to develop better protective mechanisms. But they learned an awful lot about wounding and the care provided, etc. So most of this comes from, and I apologize, I can't remember the exact name for the acronym, but it's the WEDMET database. Bellamy was one of the top guys that was associated. There were lots of other really good people, one here included, who were involved in processing and working on and adding to this database and this information. With Trunke et al., in the United States, we developed the concept of the golden hour, right? Right? Everybody should say, oh, hell yeah, I know all about that.
Don't know
all right?
Trunke, but know that.
Don't know Trunke, but he was a surgeon. That's all you need to know. Okay? They developed the concept of the golden hour. That was based on civilian trauma data collected mainly in the 1970s. And here's what they found out. They found out that there was a temporal difference in mortality. In other words, people died at a particular point in time after their injury. And what they found out was that we got about an hour to jump on these people, to start things, to get them stabilized if we're going to impact mortality. So that became known as the golden hour. Now there's some ifs and perhaps and maybes associated with this. There's been a little controversy, but for the most part, whether it's a true concept or not, it's still the concept that your trauma systems are based on today. Okay, that's, quote, golden hour. And what they found was that if you didn't get to these people for an hour after their injury, half of them would die of the entire cohort of people that got seen. Okay, if it was 2 to 3 hours, only 30% would die. And if you got to these people, wait a minute, let me say that correct. If it was 2 to 3 hours, an additional, 30% would die out of that cohort. And if it was greater than 3 hours, an additional 20%. All right, so this is cumulative. So what that means is, it takes me longer than an hour, half of them are dead. If it takes me longer than about 3 hours, another 30% are dead. If it takes me, or 2 to 3, if it takes me greater than 3, another 20% die. Okay, out of that cohort of people. So what does this tell you? It tells me that, really if I want to make the biggest possible impact, I should probably try to get to these people before an hour, right? And start their fluids and start whatever we're going to do. Okay, I still believe what we'll do at some point is we'll inject them with something hypertonic or similar. We'll give them the synthetic oxygen carrier and we'll stop their hearts. And then we'll load them up, chill them, bring them in, fix what needs fixed, and then restart them. But that won't happen next week. I've been saying for 30 years, saying that's what we're going to do. Okay, so that is the whole concept of the Trunke golden hour. All right, let's look at WEDMET. Let's look at what Bellamy came up with. Well, they looked at all these ballistic woundings, and guess what they found? If it took me greater than an hour to get to that casualty, 90% are dead. 90% versus 50%. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but that's kind of impressive that there is a difference. Beyond that, if it's a 2 to 3, an additional 8%, and then greater than 3, an additional 2%. So what does this tell you? If I want to make a difference, what time frame do I have to get to this patient for 90%? I got to get to them in less than an hour. So it's really not the golden hour thing. It's really probably less than an hour. So let's look at this information. So there's a difference. There's a difference between these mass shooting casualties or the ballistic wounded casualties and these guys. Here's the other thing to remember. This 1970s data is a conglomeration of shooting, knife, and car crash, etc. It's a group of all of those together. These guys over here, this is ballistic wounding. Okay? So, we want to look at it graphically, no big deal. This is the WEDMET data, which shows by the time you hit an hour, 90%. Here's your deaths. 90%. And then the death rate drops off precipitously after that. Okay? So what does this mean? It means that when we're talking about mass shooting events, most casualties who die at the scene. Everybody die at the scene. Okay. Most casualties who arrive to the ED for treatment will survive. Most casualties who arrive to the ED for treatment will survive. That's the main thing that this information is telling us. Now there's more to it, and I'll share that with you. There are also some paradigm exemptions. I really don't like that word, but unfortunately I have to use it from time to time. In other words, there are some situations with mass shooting events that are going to alter that dogma. Okay? But typically, if they die at the scene. If they make it to the ED, they're going to make it home. Okay? So, what else do we know? Well, we really can't go farther without at least talking a little bit about shootings versus explosions. So one of the best studies on this comes out of Israel. Kobe Peleg, a friend of mine who is the director of Israel's National Trauma Database for the entire country of Israel, did a study, looked at their information that they had on explosions and compared directly with gunshot wounds that also occurred in Israel. So ballistic wounding versus blast injury. So what could they say? Well, what they found was that traumatic brain injury was substantially higher in substantially higher in blast injuries. If there was TBI in a gunshot, they typically did not survive. Makes sense. I'm shot in the head, I'm dead, right? And if I survive it, it's usually because, and I have TBI, it's because a blast wave passed through or I was thrown against something or whatever, and that's a potentially survivable injury. So what Kobe found was that TBI is much more common with blast, and if it occurs to you, they typically die. But when you look at spinal injuries, chest, abdomen, pelvis injuries, extremities, ICU care, the length of stay was a little longer for explosions. Those are all about the same otherwise. Okay, so some of that info is potentially transferable to a degree. Those that required surgery, gunshot, 58%, 46% for explosive injuries, so really not statistically different. So about the same rate of people. So what that tells me is I know something about how many end up needing to go to the OR. So that means I could actually probably look at some of the bombing data if it discusses the flow characteristics, how many had to go to OR, how I got them to OR, how I managed, my emergency department. I could probably look at some of that, and it'll be directly applicable to these mass shooting events as well. Okay, so what that tells me is that in some areas, not so much in the specific care or the prognosis, but in some areas with regard to how they move through the system, they can be very similar. So now let's look at a few specific events. One of the best reported events, the Virginia Tech shooting. Let's look at what happens. 30 dead at the scene. Okay. 25 underwent field triage, 1 self-triaged. 1 showed up without going through triage, which is pretty impressive. Now, I guarantee that there are a lot of people that were there and potentially could have been shot that never got reported into this, but it is what it is. Out of those, 38% or 10 had to go to surgery, and out of those, 1 died. 9 survived. So 30, 40, less than 50% that arrived to the ED ended up needing surgery of some kind. So you could think of it as less than half ended up needing to go to surgery there. 15 of them, or 57%, were treated and released, or treated and put into OBS or to a observation bed. Okay. all of those people survived. So what does this one single study tell us? What it tells us is most of the dead are dead at scene. Most of the people who come to the ER for treatment survive. So, okay, well this supported that. That's nice. That's one study. It just happened to support that. So let's look at the characteristics of the wounding. Non-fatal wounds. This is way more than, for the most part, you need to know, so we're going to go through this fairly quickly. But for the most part, I looked at 3 reports that actually talked about where the wounds were. Only 3 that I could find. There's still only 3 as of about 6 months ago when I reviewed this stuff again. Is about 40-ish% of the people that show up end up going to surgery. So those 3 reports back up that one that we just talked about, and those people who weren't dead and arrived, mean about 9% surgical fatality rate. So out of all the people that show up in those 3 studies of shooting events, about 9% died after they got to the emergency department. Non-surgical cases to date, essentially all survived to discharge from hospital. So in other words, if they didn't go to, in every report that I have now, which is close to 20, if they didn't go to the OR, they ended up being discharged home alive. Okay? Well, again, that makes sense. Hopefully you're doing your triage correctly. 73% of the wounds are all soft tissue or extremity wounds. This is what you're seeing in the ER. Okay? So out of those people who arrive alive, most of it is soft tissue or extremity wounding. And we can even look at it really specifically. Anatomic location of the wounds. This comes out of Tom Stein's chapter in the 2007 Disaster Medicine, which is still, I think, the best overall review of mass shooting events at the time, are still available. So what you find is that most all were superficial soft tissue, another 26% are extremities, abdomen 8%, and then you get into a little bit different distribution. But for the most part, it makes sense. These are your non-fatal wounds. Okay, well, they hit non-fatal areas. What about the fatal wounds? The mean case fatality rate overall from all of these, I looked at 25 events here, and the question I asked was, okay, out of all these 25 events, when they made it to when they made it to the ER, and we looked at what was also at the pre-hospital, the dead at the scene. How many people died typically when somebody pulls out a gun and starts shooting in a crowded mall? About 38%. Okay, so you can look at that and say, oh, somebody has started shooting in this particular venue, about 40% rate of those wounded, of those people who are going to be wounded. Okay, and that's out of 25 events. So that's, I think, a fairly good number, and it still is supported by things since I evaluated that. About 83% of the wounds that occur you couldn't fix if they were brought to your ER 1 second later. Okay, so about 83% of the fatal wounds are typically considered to be non-survivable, non-treatable, and they're usually great vessel or head injury. Okay, again, makes sense. Casualties typically die within 5 to 15 minutes of wounding. Now, what does that tell you? How quickly can you get EMS on the scene and even start an IV on somebody?
Takes longer than that.
Takes longer than that. So almost all your casualties, again, who die at the scene, and you now know why. Have non-survivable injuries, usually to the great vessels or to the head, and they're not going to survive, and you are not going to change that unless, or probably not even if, you could get there within 5 to 15 minutes. We can't push the pre-hospital paradigm enough to get healthcare or emergency care there quick enough to have a big impact on the dead, the ones that end up being dead. Now, we hate to say that, but that's what the data are telling us. Okay? So, if I'm an astute emergency physician and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, I now know this, that in a mass shooting event I got dead people, And those who die, around 40% of all of the people who get injured, are going to die at the scene, and they're going to die within 5 minutes to 15 minutes. Is that something I can impact? What can you impact? Everybody else who makes it to the ED. You can make sure that we are improving the survivability of those that do arrive, because we've got still about a 9% fatality rate. But more than that, by knowing what we're going to face and being organized for it, we can improve the outcomes by providing better care, better dispositions to that cohort of people who survive. So I'm never going to get up in front of the news media and say, sorry, those at the scene are dead, because that's just not right in America to say anything like that. But the data are, you're not going to impact that, at least not yet. I can't hit somebody's comm badge and have them transported directly to sick bay. Doesn't happen yet. Maybe coming, but not today. Okay. We already talked about 80+% of the wounds being non-treatable. How do these people die at the scene? They bleed out, or they have CNS injury, or there may be multiple organ causes. Okay, but basically this just means I'm not sure if it was bleeding or CNS injury. So, and it makes sense. That's why people die. Okay, this is just a view that if you put it up head to head with the low case fatal wounds, which no surprise. Head and chest, pretty much top of the row. Okay? Now, you think, God, he's been going slow enough. We're going to, quote, slow down for just a second and talk about Orlando. And I do it for a particular reason. Remember I said that there are things that will change some of these paradigms, in particular the one that the dead die at the scene. We have X amount of time, okay? One of those things is the conditions at the scene itself. So I want to go through what we know about Orlando. Now, admittedly, this comes from two primary sources. It comes from several interviews and articles that were in the news media. It comes from the Department of, or Florida Department of Health. I was able to get some basic information on the numbers of people, and this also comes from personal communication, because several team health doctors at one team health facility was involved in managing some of these casualties, and so we were able to get some firsthand information. Not the best for doing research, but it's all we have. But here's what I know, what I was able to find out. 95 known casualties. Now that does not include in the total population at risk. There were a lot more people in that venue that were exposed potentially to the gunshot wounds that were able to escape or survive, that got out, and we never had a record that they were there. So I can't really give you strong percentages, but I do know that out of the 95 known casualties that we had, 39 are dead at the scene. Okay? 56 additional people, not out of these, were transported to emergency departments or went to emergency departments. Out of those, 3 or 5.4% were dead on arrival. Okay, so they transported dead people is what they did, which you shouldn't do, but okay, I get it. 65 casualties, therefore, were alive when they arrived to the emergency department. We really don't know how many immediate surgeries they had, but we do know that over the next 3 months, 72 individual surgical procedures had to be performed on this cohort of people who went to surgery. So I can't really tell you how many got rushed off to surgery, how many were delayed to go to surgery, and how many had something done and came back a month later and 2 or 3 procedures. That data just does not exist. Well, it does, but I can't get it. So out of those 65 casualties that arrived, almost 60% were treated and released. 41% were admitted to the hospital. 9 of the 65, or 13.8%, died after admission. Now remember what I told you? 9% or less that die because of the adage, they arrive alive, they stay alive, right? Well, in this case, we had quite a few more people that died. Quite a few more people that died.
I have a question on that.
Yes, sir.
Do you think, I mean, when the data is collected like that, do you think it's possible that they weren't properly categorized as DOA?
Yes.
In other words, you can be declared admitted by virtue of hitting the ED. You know how that goes.
Yeah. You know, wait a minute, I think I feel the pulse. Take them to OR.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Or
and I have no way of knowing that.
You know, when in fact you're DOA.
Yeah. And I have no way of knowing that because that degree of information was not kept. So again, it's all of this stuff. So like I said, caution with taking all of it to heart, but it does show at least the general shadows, the general proportions of things that we see. But I think the most striking thing in this particular event was the mortality rate on arrival to the hospital is quite a bit higher than we would have expected for whatever reason. And the question then becomes why?
In that situation.
Okay, that what Dr. Bickle just brought up is one good point. It's a skew in the data. It's because we're calling people alive who weren't alive and they died. Okay, so that's one potential thing.
These people were trapped for hours and they couldn't get care.
Okay, so
People had longer time to bleed.
bleed,
Yeah.
anything else? Oh, come on, say it. The ER docs and the surgeons taking care of them were incompetent, right? They didn't do nearly as good a job.
Well, you're ridiculous. I don't know any of those.
Yeah. Alcohol involvement. So mind-altering substances, alcohol, those kinds of things might also have impacted this. So we can come up with a number of things. Here's kind of, other than what Dr. Bickle said about it just being a fluke in the data because of the way, you know, what I'm calling one thing and somebody else called another, is this. Mean time to clear a scene and to start casualty transport. Out of 8 mass shootings that chose to report that time frame is approximately 45 minutes. To clearing the scene.
That's quick.
That's quick. That's way quick. Okay, what happened at Orlando? 215 minutes. What do you think that means?
Long time to bleed.
Long time to bleed. Long time to bleed.
And get shot again.
EMS sitting on their hands, couldn't, fire EMS, couldn't decide whose jurisdiction it was. No. The issue was there was a hostage situation, a standoff situation. The scene is not clear. In tactical medicine, we do not send, nor should we, emergency healthcare providers into an unstable, dangerous situation because they'll become a casualty, right? So we don't want that to happen. So to me, the reason primarily for that difference is, this is one of those things that changes that typical paradigm, is that there was a hostage situation and they had time to bleed. And those that we might have saved with fluids temporarily stabilizing them, getting them to OR and getting the broken thing fixed, they died. They bled out because we couldn't do that. Okay? Is that clear? Any questions on that? Any other comments on that? Okay. So when we look at the Orlando mass shooting, what we it's pretty much everybody dead was considered to have a non-survivable wound. Most had multiple close-range gunshot wounds, and this is an invented thing. There were 200 gunshot wounds in the 39 immediate deaths. Ignore the mean wound per patient. I just thought that was funny. Because you got to have some fun with this, right? Otherwise, you're like depressed as hell. So what are you going to do as far as managing the influx? You guys know how to take care of gunshot wounds, okay? This is not new stuff for you. And we rely on the fact, we meaning disaster docs and EMS, we rely on the fact that you guys know what you're doing with trauma and you'll be able to take care of the gunshot wounds. Okay, but there's some other caveats here. How might you manage the influx of casualties? Well, understand the basic principles of mass casualty disaster management. You have to plan also, not for the casualties, although now you kind of know how many people you might see and what their types of injuries and so on are going to be, and what's important as far as getting the ones that OR need to go, and careful evaluations, and you're also going to have to deal with families as because these people and family and loved ones are going to show up. News media is going to show up. People with political agendas are going to show up. Try to get in and interview people, try to get in and get footage. We even had, way back during the Oklahoma City bombing, Geraldo Rivera dressed up in scrubs and a mask and slung a stethoscope around his neck so that he could walk into Children's Hospital and try to interview some of the parents of the kids that were shot or were injured at that time, which was my first introduction to Geraldo Rivera. They caught him. Somebody recognized him. So
That's about all you need to know about him.
that's it. Yeah.
I'm done with him.
Yep. I'm finished. So anyway, you have to have processes and plans to deal with that. It's almost as important as your ability to take care of those patients. And we're almost finished here. In addition, forensic considerations. This is a crime. And because it's a crime, evidence needs to be collected. And evidence that is collected, even from casualties seen in the emergency department, may well be critical evidence that is utilized to convict or to exonerate somebody. Okay? So, as much as possible, and there's whole sections and lectures and talks about how do you do all these various things. As much as possible, cooperate with law enforcement agencies, but understand, and they must understand, and most do, that the clinical care takes precedence over any forensic medical collection. In other words, you do not delay clinical care that needs to be done to save that patient's life. I mean, if it's a slight delay to send them over to get an x-ray or whatever, okay, fine. But you're not delaying shipping that patient off to the OR, okay, to collect forensic information. So try to cooperate, but clinical care takes precedence. Mental health is one of the biggest things associated with mass shooting events. And the main thing that I want to say at this point is it's not so much the mental health of the community that I'm concerned about, because most communities have a plethora of mental health resources, believe it or not, and they are motivated and happy to deal with the families and the population, et cetera, but the one group they don't deal with is you. And it's like Dr. Franz said, this stuff is like radiation. The more you get exposed to and the longer you're exposed to it, the sicker you get. And we carry this stuff with us, whether you believe you do or not. And so there needs to be within your department some form of mechanism to deal with the fact that you've just seen 15 casualties from a mass shooting event, half of which are children. I mean, it's a little easier to understand when a tornado comes through and does this. Okay, because we can either be angry at God or angry at nature, or not angry at anybody, because it's no one's fault. It's a little harder when it's a fellow human being that has done this for no reason. Much, much more difficult. And so this can be as simple as sitting down afterwards and talking with a colleague a little bit. That's really all that about 80% of anybody needs for the next few days, is just occasionally sit down and talk about it. To actual formal debriefing periods. After the Luby's mass shooting occurred at Fort Hood, when I was there, we actually had a chaplain for the hospital who had just recently transferred there from Ramstein, recently after they had the big air show disaster back in the 80s in Ramstein. And he had conducted multiple debriefing sessions, etc., with the healthcare providers there. And so he was ready. And it was just real simple. He brought us all into a room about this size, all of the ER docs and nurses and everybody who was taking care of all these mass shooting victims, and brought us all in there together and sat us down, and we all just started talking. And I mean, we are bawling like babies. And yet afterwards, that was pretty much it. You know, we were okay. We're not good, but we're going to get better, and we're going to go back to work. And to this day, I bless him for doing that, because so many of us had, you know, we were really, you can't explain it unless you've been there, but you can imagine it. All right. So what really happens, we don't see a lot of psych stuff in the ERs after these kinds of events. This was a study that looked at a number of them. Typically the community has good functional mental health stuff that they get referred to. So we don't really see a whole lot of it. But out of those that are seen, PTSD is the primary thing that happens. I mean, to this day, I remember vividly, I was in one of the first people on the scene at one of the mass shootings in Texas, Luby's, which for a long time was the #1 mass shooting. Guy drove his truck into Luby's cafeteria and shot people. And I was one of the first people there, and one of the first people I saw on the scene was my son's vice principal from his school. I knew her well, you know, and she's brains are blowed all over and stuff. Yeah, that was a little shocking. Didn't notice it at the time, noticed it later. The bomb goes off in Oklahoma City, and I end up going out to help respond and helped work through that event and go home. And that night, I sat down and get ready to go to bed, and I literally, it's like, you know, you hear about the flashbacks. I smell mashed potatoes, peas, and brains. And I get these vivid images of Luby's all over again, triggered by that event. So this shit stays with you. And even though, you know, we'd been debriefed. So it's just part of what it is. You understand it, you deal with it. But PTSD is the biggest thing. We don't need to go into the details. What about long-term prognosis? You know, the people who make it home physically, most of them actually end up being able to go back to work. In this study, which is the only study done on a mass shooting, 66% of the people of those who were evaluated, treated, either gone to OR or whatever. So what are our implications for the trauma systems? We really can't alter our pre-hospital paradigm. We're not going to be able to get there quick enough. But maybe in the future there'll be some things that we can do to try to get there quicker, be more organized, clear the scene quicker. I don't know. But right now, not a lot of impact. The guys are doing the best they can do. Remember those altered mortality curves? It's not the golden hour, it's the golden 5 minutes. All right? And most who die, die where? And most who live are the ones that made it to the ER. Okay, sounds stupid, but you'd be surprised how many people will not do their planning based on that paradigm, and you need to. Remember the mental health management for yourself and for others. Forensic consider don't trump clinical, but they're important. Safety and security conditions, you got to shut down the ER and the whole hospital. Limit access. It's imperative, and it's a big deal in particular for mass media management. You don't want to be the one they shove the camera in your face and unexpectedly, and you say something really stupid, okay, which then go, you know, they always, it's like, you know, the tornado happened and they go find the stupidest person they can find in the whole trailer park, you know, and there's some really stupid people that can be found there, and that's the one that's on the news media, you know, representing your state.
Time for hi, Mom.
Yeah, and you don't want to be there. All right, so we're going to see mass shootings. They're going to continue. Specific planning, you guys now know more than 90% of other emergency physicians who care for people. And when a mass casualty event occurs and that event happens to be a mass shooting, you're going to know more than most anybody just because you sat or slept through most of this. Okay? So, I hope that kind of gives you an idea of what we try to do in disaster medicine. We try to look at these events and we try to provide information to all of medicine, but in particular emergency medicine, that can make you do a better job. There are similar things with tornadoes and floods and hey, guess what? November, you know, they're close months. November this year, 16th and 17th at Norman Regional Health Place.
Everybody's showing up.
They're going.
You guys going?
They are directed to show up.
Awesome.
Everybody's
I promise you,
Can't moonlight the night before.
first day what we're doing is we're covering similar stuff. You won't see this because I'm not doing this, but you will see tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, done in a better way. We're going to talk about here's how this impacts you as an emergency physician. In the afternoon, whether you go to the tactical school or you go to the mass casualty school, much better, much better. That's really the one that you want to go to, not the tactical school. But the mass casualty school is basically focused for ER docs. Tactical school is mainly focused for medics, although you guys can get a lot out of that too. So it doesn't really matter which one you go to.
Is this everybody thing? Anybody want to show
This
up?
is anybody, everybody. This is, in fact, there's CME. Where we've applied for, THI is helping us do our CME for it.
Yeah, and we have you all off for this. You all are blocked off. There are no residents in the emergency department starting that night.
Thank you.
The next day, we have, and so this is not an elective. Y'all are, I'm going to put it out again, but y'all are,
Thank you so much.
You're directed to be there. You're absolutely directed.
I promise we'll.
Shift before that, or after, you better just find somebody else to cover
I
it.
promise we'll make it worth your while. And like the mass casualty thing, here's what we're going to do. The first thing I'm going to teach you to do is how to do a rapid triage assessment. Let's say you're the triage doc out in the front door of your ER, and you got a mass casualty disaster event, and you got a bunch of casualties coming in. How do you do that exam? How do you collect that information in a short period of time to make a really good triage decision? Okay, it's not the only method, but it's a good method. It's kind of based on the military. Imagine that. But you're going to go through that, and everybody's going to actually do that exam, and then you're going to learn about when and how you do a mass or hasty decontamination of a casualty. What if it's a radiation? What if it's a hazmat? What if it's a whatever? You have that, and then you're going to work in teams, and you're going to take an ER tabletop, and you're going to arrange that ER as you would like to arrange it based on the principles that we'll teach you to receive casualties. And then the final part is you're going to receive casualties. And you're going to have to triage those casualties and run them through your system. I think by the time you do that, if you didn't know the basic principles of mass casualty management, you will. And then the next day we got a bunch of really cool speakers, including Kevin Clower. What is his official title? He's Director of Emergency Medicine for Team Health. But
He's head of risk management. He's the chief officer for emergency medicine for Team Health.
Kevin is he's been a speaker at ASAP and at ACOEP. A lot of you guys, if you've been to ACOEP, you've seen Kevin. Very, very good talk, very, very entertaining. So he's going to be there, plus a bunch of other folks. So yeah, I'm really excited about this. And in fact, I need one person maybe from this program, if they're interested in helping me do the mass casualty course. I will train you up over the next couple of months and have you help me as an instructor. So just think about it. Somebody that might have some experience. They can have zero. I'll train them up because I'm going to need some assistance and some instructors for that. And I'm trying to spread it around to all the programs. That's it, guys. I'm sorry I went over.
I wanted to have a couple of comments. It's an excellent talk. I really appreciate it. One thing that one of my many former jobs, one is at the MRDC, Medical Research Development Command, when I was in the military. Ron Bellamy was there. We overlapped. He was considerably older than I was, which makes him real old.
Yeah.
But he was my experiences with him, you had quoted him, incredibly bright and incredibly well resourced.
Yeah.
And anything you read of his is just outstanding, and he was an incredibly good scientist. One of the things that he had done, and everybody has forgotten this, or conveniently, because it's like if it doesn't meet the paradigm of the thought process, it's conveniently ignored. Everybody quotes that Vietnam had better outcomes than World War II. Ron went back and dissected all that data, and what he found was that was not the case. And what was the case is Vietnam had a bunch of data thrown in on CRO. It's called Care for Record Only. In other words, I show up at the aid station, and Care for Record Only could be, I had trouble sleeping last night. Can I get something to help me sleep? Or I have a sore throat. It may have absolutely nothing to do. Or it kind of scratched my skin. I need a little Band-Aid here. What they did find was World War II had very few CROs, or care for record only. That what we were much better at is collecting, is generating charts in
Wow,
Vietnam.
I was not aware of
When he
that.
took out the CROs, the care for record only included people that basically died at the battlefield or were admitted. That was his set, that they really had no difference between Vietnam. And there were two things that happened between World War II and Vietnam. Number one, they were on this high crystalloid theory in Vietnam. And that in World War II, it was, which we've learned, everybody's heard of the study, the 1-to-1-to-1. And that's what they basically did during World War II. It was 1-to-1-to-1. They were transfusing from one soldier to the next. They were having walking blood banks. They knew their blood type. Hey, we need you over here. And it was fresh blood. The second thing was permissive hypotension, which they practiced during. And it's just kind of interesting. The second thing I wanted to mention is that I agree with you in some ways. There's one thing I think there's a big differentiation also is when you look at these mass casualties, it is what is the weapon? A high velocity weapon is going to be much more problematic than a low velocity, because after about 5-10 centimeters it cavitates. The high velocity vibrates and it creates this big cavity. And that's one thing, and that Orlando shooting, I looked it up, it was a high velocity. It was a military weapon. The only thing it didn't do is automatic, it was semi-automatic. It wouldn't go to automatic, but when you get it as civilian, but it was a military weapon. So it's kind of an apples to oranges, and some of that may have been multiple shots that these people had, even the survivors, number one, number two, they were as opposed to the civilian weapon, some of the mass shootings. Yeah, but it was a 9mm, high velocity, that they had there. But it's kind of interesting when you get into some of these differences. But that's outstanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your time.
So we need to write a paper, you're saying?
Yeah, I think that, when you start teasing that out, but, that some of these mass shootings are, they're handgun and I think, like I said, in the difference military-civilian, you could probably break it down even, it's high velocity, low velocity.
Okay.
It's
Awesome.
Do you have a quick tip if you are cornered by media to be that person that they're looking for a quote? Do you make sure that you honor the patient's privacy, or do you turn it over to administrators? Do you have a quick pointer?
You turn it over to administration. It's a, hey, I'm sorry, I don't.
I'm busy working.
Yeah, I don't just look at them and be rude or whatever. Say, hey, as you know, I can't talk about specific patients. However, our public relations officer, who maybe you know by name, I probably should in that setting, is right over there. Take care of patients. Yeah, you just don't. You don't want to get it caught off guard. And they'll talk to anybody. It could be a medical student rotating through the ED, and if it's somebody who'll talk with them, man, they suck that right up. I really learned to distrust and hate the media more than anything during the Oklahoma City bombing. And part of that was because you made me go talk to them. So anyway, thank you very much, guys, for letting me. Well, you ready?